Paracelsus, the magical and heretical doctor. The embattled forces of conservative orthodoxy are so strong that one is sometimes tempted to wonder how it is that the world ever goes round at all, how it is that the forward movement of progress succeeds as it apparently does in getting the better of so many retrograde tendencies, so much prejudice, so strong a clinging to the stereotyped conditions of the day. After all, the more one thinks about it, the more one becomes convinced that the whole progress of the world is the work of the very, very few, that the positive and progressive intellect is the rare exception, and that if democratic conditions really prevailed, as of course they never do, all civilization would go backwards and gradually revert once more to chaos. What a mockery, after all, democracy is. And how hopelessly the modern world is deluded in thinking that anywhere or at any time democracy has in reality held sway. As a matter of fact, the many have never ruled, have never wished to rule. They have merely asked for some strong man to lead them. Where was ever the flock of sheep that did not follow the bellwether? Here and there we meet with a mastermind that, for good or evil, leads the multitude. Or, if he does not lead, at least points the way where others will eventually follow. Side by side with him, we see the multitude either drifting or being led. Work, said Voltaire, that most popular of writers, work for the little public. Voltaire knew, as all great leaders have known before and after, that it is the little public that ever dominates the situation. It is the little leaven that leaveneth the whole lump. It is a sight beloved of the gods, says the old saying, to see a good man struggling against adversity. But is it not a finer sight still to see a strong man battling with the forces of orthodoxy and refusing to yield his ground? A man of such a mould was Philip Bombast of Hohenheim, better known by his assumed name of Paracelsus. Never was there anyone to whom Shelley's celebrated line, "The sun comes out and many reptiles spawn," was more absolutely appropriate. The hostility and venomous antagonism of his own profession, with a few notable exceptions, followed and persecuted him throughout his entire medical career. The boldness and independence of his medical attitude galled the leaders as well as the rank and file of the profession. But what was still more galling to them than his lack of orthodoxy was the fact that his novel methods, as they must have appeared to the doctors of that day, were so immeasurably more successful than their own. Paracelsus indeed never gave nor asked for quarter. John the Baptist, denouncing the Pharisees who came to him as a generation of vipers, was no bad parallel to Paracelsus's stinging invective on the ignorance and tradition-loving proclivities of his own profession. Many to whom the name of Paracelsus is familiar are accustomed to look upon him as little more than a singularly successful quack who revived the traditions of an earlier school of occultism in defiance of the more scientific methods of his own time. As a matter of fact, the doctors of his day were, in the vast majority of cases, merely theorists with little real practical experience, but with a fair store of book learning of a very indifferent kind. It was Paracelsus whose medical knowledge was derived from experiment and experience, and who had acquired the greater part of his medical and surgical skill from wide and varied traveling and visiting more countries and more different nationalities than any other medical expert of his day, and who had learnt by actual association with all sorts and conditions of men in different climes far more than any book learning had ever taught him. The period of Paracelsus's career coincided with the Reformation of Luther and with the wider and more general Renaissance movement. This latter development had brought back in its train the study of classical learning and classical ideals, which had fallen into discredit about the period of the first triumph of Christianity and its establishment as a world religion. The attitude of the earlier Christians, who looked upon the pagan deities as devils and Greek and Roman classical writers as apologists for devil worship, had passed away, and the highest dignitaries of the Church were now often noted for their classical erudition and ripe scholarship. With the return of classical ideals came back also into favor in a number of unexpected quarters the doctrines of Neoplatonism. When Hypatia perished at Alexandria, Orthodox Christianity set its foot on Plotinus and all his works. The struggle at the end had been one rather between Christianity and the later Greek philosophers, with their Neoplatonic conceptions, than between Christianity and pagan Rome. The gods of Rome were dead already. Pan was dead past resurrecting. The danger that threatened Christianity was the triumph of such emperors as Julian the Apostate. Julian, whose master was Plotinus, and whose religion was Neoplatonism merely dressed in an old Roman garb. To the thinkers and philosophers of that time, the triumph of Christianity seemed like the victory of exoteric religion over the inner esoteric truths. Back now, with all that was best of the scholarship and art of Greece and Rome, came the mystic doctrines of the Alexandrian philosophers, back, not in triumph, but daring once more to reassert themselves in the face of a hostile world that had long even forgotten their existence. 1,000 years separated Hypatia from Cornelius Agrippa, 1,000 years which, in the realm of thought, might well be characterized as the Dark Ages. Cornelius Agrippa von Nettesheim was born at Cologne in 1486. 7 years later, on the 10th of November 1493, at Einsiedeln near Zurich, a son was born to Dr. Wilhelm Bombast von Hohenheim and was christened Theophrastus, in honor of Theophrastus Tirtamos, a Greek physician, philosopher, and follower of Aristotle. This child was subsequently to be known to fame and held up to obloquy under the title of Paracelsus. It was a period in which the world was in labor with great events. Only a year before Columbus had landed on American soil. In the same year, or the previous one, passed away a man whose life was destined to create as great a revolution in the history of the human race as that of Columbus himself, William Caxton. Returning from a long sojourn in the Netherlands in or about 1474, Caxton established his printing press in the precincts of Westminster Abbey, and before his death at least 64 books are known to have been issued from this first English printing house. 10 years exactly before Paracelsus's birth, a third of these great makers of revolutions had seen the light. On the 10th of November 1483, Martin Luther was born at Eisleben in Lower Saxony, and when the subject of these notes was 24 years old, Luther nailed his 95 theses against the doctrine of indulgences on the church door at Wittenberg. Paracelsus, when occasion offered, did not attempt to disguise his sympathy with this bold reformer, though he took no actual part in the movement, and he was accused by his enemies of being a medical Luther, a charge which he took pains to show that he did not in any way resent. Another noteworthy character in the realm of history and literature, Lorenzo de' Medici, had passed away a year before our hero's birth. In England, the Wars of the Roses were over, and Henry VII was busy establishing monarchy on a firm basis, the people, worn out by incessant struggles, being glad to accept the Tudor rule, sympathetic as it always was to the middle and commercial classes. In Europe, there was no Austrian emperor, and Italy was still fated, for centuries to come, to remain a geographical expression. The Holy Roman Empire extended from the German Ocean and the Baltic Sea on the north to the Adriatic on the south. Poland and Lithuania extended far along its eastern border, and the outmost limit of the realm of the Muscovite was still 500 miles east of the site, where a century later Peter the Great was to found and give his name to the capital of the Russian Empire. The conquering Turk was thundering at the gates of Christendom. Ferdinand and Isabella, patrons of Columbus, reigned at Madrid. Everywhere throughout the civilized world, vast changes were impending. Everywhere the horizon was widening and men's minds were being directed into new channels and to fresh fields of enterprise and of opinion. There has been much discussion as to what exactly is connoted by the name Paracelsus and how it came to be first adopted. What seems clear is that von Hohenheim adopted the name himself and was not, as some have held, given it by his admirers. It was a usual practice in those days to write books under some Latin nom de plume, frequently some adaptation into Latin of the name of the writer. In all probability, the last two syllables of the name Celsus were suggested by Hohen, or high, Hohenheim, being literally translated as high home. With regard to the first two syllables, it is noticeable that these were occasionally employed by Paracelsus in giving name to his medical treatises. There is thus one treatise called Paramirum and another Paragranum. This word para seems to have been used in the sense of giving the word to which it was prefixed a superlative value. Thus, Paramirum would mean extremely wonderful. The whole word is doubtless a polyglot hodgepodge, the first part being Greek and the second Latin. But medieval writers had little scruple in adapting the classical tongues to their own requirements. To follow the writings of Paracelsus, it is necessary to understand his phraseology, his jargon, as we should call it in the slang of today. Without this, he is as incomprehensible as is the dog Latin of a scientific textbook to one who is not a scientific specialist, or, to give another example, as the language of astrology is to one who is not an astrologer. Paracelsus held that there were three basic substances necessary to the existence of all bodies. These he called sulfur, mercury, and salt. Sulfur corresponds to fire, or rather to the principle of inflammability, mercury to water or fluidity, and salt to earth or solidity. For a full glossary of the terms which he employed, readers are referred to the volume on the life and philosophy of Paracelsus by the late Dr. Franz Hartmann. In this terminology, azoth stands for the creative principle in nature, or the spiritual vitalizing force. The elec primum is the causative force. Cherio, the essence of the thing, the fifth principle, which constitutes what we call its essential qualities. The avestrum is man's astral body, his ethereal counterpart that may act to him as guardian angel and warn him of dangers. The elementaries are the astral corpses of the dead, and must not be confused with the elementals or nature spirits, sylphs, salamanders, undines, and gnomes. Magic is the conscious employment of spiritual powers to act on external nature. It is clear, though Paracelsus long antedated Hahnemann, the founder of homeopathy, that much of his medical teaching is what we should now call homeopathic. Hahnemann, in fact, borrowed extensively from Paracelsus. Take, for instance, Paracelsus's teaching with regard to the quintessence or virtue of each substance. This, he taught, though infinitesimal in quantity even in large bodies, had nonetheless the power to affect the mass through and through as a single drop of gall embitters or a few grains of saffron color a large quantity of water. There are wide differences, says Paracelsus, between what the ancient doctors taught and what we here teach, and therefore our healing art differs widely from theirs. For we teach that what heals a man also wounds him, and what wounded will also heal him. For the nettle can be so changed that it cannot burn, the flame so that it does not scorch, and the chelidony so that it does not cicatrize. Thus similars are good in healing, such and such a salt to such and such a sore, and the things which heal a wound in nature heal the same sort of wound in man. Many kinds of rust, says Paracelsus again, occur in the minerals, for each mineral has its own peculiar nature. This rust is in the form of a disease, and iron has one disease, while copper has another. In a similar way, a man has a sore, and it is healed by treatment. The metal, too, has a sore, and can be healed by treatment. Metallic bodies, says Paracelsus, are as liable to death as the others, for their salt is arsenic. The whole earth is linked together, and the life that passes through the bodies of men passes also through the bodies of minerals. Paracelsus had no patience with those who taught of a panacea that would heal all diseases. He described them as people who rode all horses with one saddle, through whom more harm than good was effected. He maintained that a doctor must know the sick and all matters appertaining to their state, just as a carpenter knows his wood. He mentions 6 essential qualifications for the practical physician. A doctor must know how many kinds of tissue there are in the body, and how each kind stands in relation to the man. He must know all the bones, such as the ribs and their coverings, the difference between one and another, their relations to each other, and their articulations. He must know all the blood vessels, the nerves, the cartilages, and how they are held together. He must know the length, number, form, condition, and purpose of each member of the body, its particular flesh, marrow, and all other details. He must know where all emunctoria lie and how they are to be averted, also what is in every cavity of the body and everything about the intestines. He must, with all his might and being, seek to understand about life and death, what the chief organs in man mean, and what each member can and may suffer. If we look to Paracelsus as the real founder of homeopathy, so also must we regard him as the pioneer of magnetism and magnetic healing. Man, he maintained, is nourished through the magnetic power which resides in all nature and by which each individual being draws its specific nourishment to itself. He called this magnetic force mumia and laid great stress on the healing power which resided in it. Just as the power of the lily breaks forth in perfume which is invisible, so, he writes, the invisible body sends forth its healing influence. Just as in the visible body are wonderful activities which the senses can perceive, so too lie powers in the invisible body which can work great wonders. To him the whole universe was one, and knit together by indissoluble bonds. The astral currents created by the imagination of the macrocosmos, he writes, act upon the microcosmos and produce certain states in the latter, and likewise the astral currents produced by the imagination and will of man produce certain states in external nature. And these currents may reach far, because the power of the imagination reaches as far as thought can go. Here, in a single paragraph, is the philosophy of astrology and the justification for the efficacy of prayer. I have said that Paracelsus was the father of homeopathy, and the father also of that later school of animal magnetism which was founded in France in the latter part of the 18th century, the inception of which is always associated with the name of Mesmer. Unfortunately, Mesmer had neither the knowledge nor the intuitive faculties of his master. But there is reason to believe that magnetic healing is destined to play a far greater part in the future of medical art than it has ever done in the past. Not only was Paracelsus a pioneer in homeopathy and animal magnetism, he was also one of the first, as well as one of the greatest, of all faith healers. Faith, he says, has a great deal more power than the physical body. All magical processes are based upon faith. The power of faith overcomes all spirits of nature, because it is a spiritual power, and spirit is higher than nature. Whatever is grown in the realm of nature may be changed by the power of faith. Anything we may accomplish which surpasses nature is accomplished by faith, and by faith diseases may be cured. Imagination, he says again, is the cause of many diseases. Faith is the cure for all. If we cannot cure a disease by faith, it is because our faith is too weak. But our faith is weak on account of our want of knowledge. If we were conscious of the power of God within ourselves, we should never fail. The power of amulets does not rest so much in the material of which they are made as in the faith with which they are worn. Paracelsus's chosen motto was, Alterius non sit qui sus esse potest. Let him not belong to another who has the power to be his own. Paracelsus declined to follow any leader, but formed his own conclusions from his own experience. For him, the Codex Naturae was a system which led straight to exact knowledge, and he rejected whatever could not be verified by research. He laid the foundations of a new system, built on evidence rather than on the outworn traditions of the medicine of his day. This system comprised within itself at once a practical guide to the medical art and a spiritual philosophy of life. The fatal error of divorcing the physical from the spiritual and treating the physical as a thing apart, which has rendered abortive so much of the medical research of recent generations, would undoubtedly have been obviated had the modern exponents of the medical art realized that in Paracelsus was to be found a pioneer who brought the life-giving genius of his intellect to bear on old truths in their relation to modern problems, rather than a quack and mountebank who deluded his contemporaries into the idea that he had accomplished marvelous cures where the medical faculty of his day could show nothing but a record of failures.